She stole $110,000 from me, then stood next to me in church and told everyone I was losing my mind. I stood there, shaking, holding back tears, and everyone looked at me like I was the crazy one. That moment broke something inside me. But what she didn't know is that I had already started setting the trap. And once it snapped shut, every lie she told, every mask she wore, would fall. What would you do if your own sister tried to erase not just your money, but your dignity? I was still holding the receipt in my hand when the card machine beeped a second time. Declined. Again. The cashier looked at me, polite but firm, and said the same thing he'd said 30 seconds earlier. The card didn't go through. My grocery cart was already bagged up, eggs on top, half-wilted lettuce at the bottom. Behind me, the line was growing longer, restless. The woman with the baby gave me a tight smile. The man in scrubs behind her sighed and glanced at his watch. I didn't panic. Not right away. I pulled out another card. A backup. Swiped. Declined. Again. The clerk shifted, uncomfortable now. I could feel my ears getting hot. I wasn't embarrassed about not having money. I had money, or at least I had it yesterday. What rattled me was the sudden wrongness of it all, like a chair pulled out just before you sit down. Then I heard her voice behind me. "Oh no, Maureen, did you forget to pay your bills again?" I froze. My sister, Lila. She was holding a bundle of fresh tulips and smiling like we were in a commercial for springtime family love. She didn't even wait for me to answer. "She's been having a hard time keeping up lately," Lila told the clerk, leaning in conspiratorially. "Cognitive slippage, poor thing." The clerk chuckled awkwardly. The woman with the baby made a face I couldn't quite read. I looked down at my receipt again, like it would explain something, like it would save me. I told the clerk I'd come back for the groceries. I left the store with my chin high, but my heart pounding. Lila followed me out like she'd just done me a favor. She offered to drive me home. I declined. She pretended to be hurt. That walk to the car was the longest of my life, and I've buried a husband, a best friend, and 2 brothers. But nothing prepares you for the humiliation of being treated like you're losing your mind, especially by the one person who knows exactly how sharp you are. I sat in the driver's seat and just breathed for a while. I didn't even turn the key. I just sat there, staring at the dashboard, wondering what else she'd taken from me. Because make no mistake, Lila didn't guess I had problems with my account. She knew. She counted on it. I checked my bank app before I pulled out of the lot. 3 large transactions stared back at me. Spa treatment package, boutique jewelry, weekend retreat at a coastal resort. All within the past 5 days. All through my main credit card. The total was over $110,000. I closed the app, sat very still. I wasn't angry yet. That would come later. What I felt then was colder, more focused. A clarity I hadn't tasted in years. The kind of clarity that comes when you know the person you've protected, forgiven, even pitied, has declared war on you. Some of you listening might be wondering why I didn't call the bank right then, freeze the card, report the fraud. I'll tell you why. Because Lila had done this before. Little things. A bill she forgot to pay. A withdrawal she meant to ask about. Always just below the threshold of proof. Always wrapped in sugary concern and tilted head smiles. And every time I called her out, I looked like the bitter old widow who couldn't manage her own life. Meanwhile, she played the part of the doting younger sister trying her best. This time, I wasn't going to react. I was going to plan. I needed proof. And not just proof she used my card. I needed to expose the whole structure of her lies. How she used pity like a crowbar, how she whispered poison to my neighbors, how she pretended to protect Daniel's legacy while quietly erasing it. You see, my late husband Daniel was a man people respected, a war veteran, a principled accountant. But in the last few months before he passed, someone had begun spreading rumors about his finances, about debts, about poor choices. I thought it was just idle gossip. But now I wasn't so sure. I drove home without touching the radio. The silence helped me think. When I pulled into the driveway, I didn't go inside right away. I sat with the engine off and stared at the bird bath Daniel built with his hands 20 years ago. The water inside was still, undisturbed. I took that as a sign. Inside, I opened the small fireproof lockbox where I kept my old paperwork. I pulled Daniel's last signed loan forms. I checked the signatures. I stared at them so long my eyes watered. Then I placed them beside the printed receipts from my stolen transactions. They didn't match, not even close. I felt the first ripple of rage then, but it was quiet, like heat rising from concrete. I went to the kitchen, poured myself some tea, sat at the table, and pulled out my notebook. First page, a list of Lila's past mistakes. Second page, timeline of all recent charges. Third page, list of people I trusted. Eleanor Pruitt went at the top. This wasn't going to be a scream-in-the-rain revenge. This was going to be methodical, precise, legal. She took my money. She insulted my mind. She used Daniel's name like a rag to wipe her messes. And she thought she got away with it. But I had already begun. If you've ever had someone smile in your face while cutting the ground from under your feet, you'll understand. Some betrayals don't just wound, they sharpen you. And I was sharpening. The morning after the grocery store, I was up by 6. I hadn't slept more than 3 hours, but my mind was alert. Sharp in a way it hadn't been in years. The kind of sharp that comes not from panic, but purpose. I went straight to the desk in the sunroom, where I kept my files and the old laptop Daniel used to call a relic. It still worked just fine. I opened it, booted up the bank portal, and printed every statement I could find. 3 months back. Personal checking, savings, and both credit cards. Then I logged into the email account linked to those cards. If Lila had received any purchase confirmations and forgot to delete them, I wanted to know. I didn't find any emails. Of course I didn't. Lila was careful. She always had been. The kind of careful that smiles at you while stealing your coat and hanging it in her own closet. But something else caught my eye. On the bank page, under account features, was a tab for virtual cards. I clicked. Create a temporary card, limit it to specific stores, set an expiration, track all usage separately. I stared at the screen. Then I created one. I set the spending limit to $200, linked it to a clean sub-account, and marked the card for physical pickup only. No online orders. Then I wrote the 16 digits down in a fresh notebook. This card would be bait. A line cast into the water. Now I just needed Lila to take it. But first, I had to understand how she got access in the first place. I stood in the kitchen with my phone and pulled up the charge history again. Her pattern was exact, not chaotic like an identity thief from halfway across the world. No, these were well-timed purchases. Spa days always fell on Fridays. Jewelry purchases landed midweek, never over the weekend. And the resort booking had been made 2 days after Daniel's memorial service. She waited until I was grieving and distracted to strike. I closed the banking app and opened the metal drawer under the sink. That was where I kept my house keys, along with the old keychain Daniel gave me on our 25th anniversary. The ring was full, too full. And there it was. A spare key I'd given Lila a year ago after I'd had a bad fall in the garden. I never asked for it back. I went to the front door and changed the lock. It took me 20 minutes. I used to watch Daniel do it. He was meticulous. I did it the way he taught me. No drama, no fumbling. Just remove, replace, and test. When it clicked, I knew that was the sound of the first wall going up between her and my life. Then I opened the old contacts file on the computer and clicked on a name I hadn't touched in over a year, Eleanor Pruitt. Eleanor was a retired audit manager. She'd mentored me when I worked in hospital billing back in my 40s, sharp as a scalpel, no nonsense, and loyal to the bone. I sent her a message with only 2 lines. Need help tracing internal financial theft. Small scale. Personal. Quiet. Can I call? She replied in less than 10 minutes. Of course you can. I never liked your sister. I called. Eleanor didn't ask for backstory. She asked for facts. Card dates, store names, merchant codes. She told me to download a spreadsheet and start listing every charge I suspected. Then to look for pattern repetition, merchant overlap, refund timings. I had never thought about refunds. But she had. She also said one thing that stuck. If she's this methodical, then she's not finished. That chilled me, because Eleanor was right. Lila had never done something just once. She tested boundaries, then she pushed, then she rewrote the rules. This wasn't about the money, not anymore. It was about humiliation, discrediting me, making me look unstable so she could step in as the sane one, the helpful sibling, maybe even get her hands on whatever Daniel left behind. I didn't know how deep she was willing to go, but I was going to find out. By lunchtime, I had 3 sheets filled with transaction data, each with dates, amounts, merchant categories. I highlighted every pattern in yellow and cross-referenced the dates with Daniel's last weeks alive. That was when I saw something I hadn't expected. One of the transactions Lila made with my card was at a notary office. That wasn't spa or jewelry. That was legal. I called the number listed next to the merchant ID. A woman answered, said they didn't give information over the phone. I thanked her and hung up. I would visit them in person later. But first, I needed to protect what I still had. I opened a second account under a new name variation, transferred my emergency savings into it, closed the old card and left the virtual one open, untouched, like cheese on a trap. I sat back and looked at the wall. The picture of Daniel was still hanging straight. He always hated crooked frames. I whispered to the air, just to myself. She thinks I'm old. She thinks I'll fold. She's wrong. I went back to the spreadsheet and added one more column. A red one. Notes, intent, possible manipulation. It was no longer about defending myself. It was about building a case. Quiet, legal, final. By sundown, I had the beginnings of it all. And Lila had no idea her clock had started ticking. By the next morning, the spreadsheet had grown into something that looked less like a list of transactions and more like a map. Eleanor had taught me how to layer things, not just amounts and dates, but behavior, repetition, timing, emotional triggers. She always said, people reveal themselves in patterns. Money just helps you see it faster. I'd printed 3 copies, one for me, one for Eleanor, and one for someone I hadn't spoken to yet, but knew I would soon need. Someone official. But before I involved anyone else, I had to be absolutely certain. And to do that, I had to look at Lila the way a stranger would. Cold. Objective. Detached from the memories of shared bedrooms and matching dresses and birthday cakes with both our names on them. I started by going back to Daniel's files. Not the digital ones. The real ones. His paperwork. In the attic, behind an old cedar trunk, I pulled out the locked box he used to keep anything tax-related. It smelled like old envelopes and cedar oil, and for a moment I had to sit down. The box still had his handwriting on the label. Black ink. Neat. Always neat. Inside there were manila folders, rubber-banded receipts, and a sealed envelope marked Notarized 2021. That year stuck with me. It was 4 months before his cancer came back. 8 months before he died. I opened the envelope. Inside were copies of 2 documents. One was a personal loan agreement for $10,000. The other was an amendment to a smaller life insurance policy. Both had Daniel's signature. At least it looked like his signature. But it was too smooth, too evenly slanted. Daniel's writing always had a tight curl on his D. This looked like someone had practiced. I placed the page next to a birthday card he'd written to me that same year. The difference was clear. I stared at the paper for a long time. Then I called Eleanor. She didn't answer, but I left a message. Confirmed document forgery. Will follow up with scan. Then I took photos, scanned the paperwork, and saved everything under a password-protected folder. I didn't trust cloud storage, not with this. The next step was to check the notary office that had shown up in my bank statements. I drove across town. The place was tucked between a dry cleaner and a vape shop, nothing fancy. Inside it was quiet, just the hum of a printer and a woman behind a plastic divider. I asked her if she could confirm a document signed by Daniel Hale had been notarized here in March 2021. She looked at me cautiously and said she couldn't give out client information without a court request. I told her I understood. But then I asked if I could speak to the notary who signed it, just to ask about their process. She said the notary was in the back. 5 minutes later, a man in his 50s came out. Glasses, blue flannel shirt. Looked tired. I introduced myself, gave him Daniel's name, and asked if he remembered notarizing a loan amendment for a man by that name. He didn't hesitate. "Oh yeah," he said. But it wasn't Daniel who came in. It was a woman. Said she had power of attorney. Signed on his behalf. He even remembered the name. Lila Hart. I thanked him, walked back to the car, and sat there gripping the wheel. That was it. That was the confirmation. Lila hadn't just used my credit card. She hadn't just lied about my mental state. She had signed documents under my husband's name. Documents that could have changed financial records. And if left unchecked, that forged signature could be used to argue that Daniel had debts or made poor decisions at the end of his life. It was character assassination, not just theft. And worse, it could have been used to justify seizing parts of our joint estate if anything had gone to court. I drove home with both hands tight on the wheel. No music, no noise. Back in the kitchen, I laid everything out on the table. The forged signature, the loan form, the receipts from my account, the notary's confirmation, the log of every transaction Lila had made since Daniel passed. Then I opened a fresh page in my notebook and titled it, Motive. Why now? Why so much? Why the escalation? And slowly the answer began to take shape. She wasn't just angry at me, she was rewriting history. Lila had loved Daniel. Years ago she'd confessed it in a drunk whisper at our mother's wake. Said he had looked at her first. I thought she was grieving, rambling. I told her to go lie down, but maybe she'd held on to that feeling. Maybe all these years of pretending to support our marriage, of acting like the sweet younger sister, maybe that was the act. And when Daniel died, it wasn't grief that hit her. It was opportunity. I leaned back and let the idea settle. This wasn't about money. It wasn't even about me. It was about Daniel, about taking back something she thought belonged to her. I felt a wave of sickness rise in my throat, but I swallowed it down. because beneath the disgust, a colder feeling was forming. Resolve. If Lila wanted to play inheritance games, legacy games, memory games, she picked the wrong opponent, because I wasn't going to shout. I wasn't going to accuse. I was going to document, to collect, to time everything right. Then I was going to ruin her, quietly, thoroughly, and legally. I folded the documents, slid them into an envelope, and locked it in my file drawer. Then I called Eleanor. When she picked up, I said only one thing. She forged Daniel's name. Eleanor went silent for a beat, then said, "Then we're not just talking fraud." I said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. It had already begun. The first shot she fired came through the church bulletin. Late Thursday afternoon, I was sitting in my living room reviewing statements when my neighbor Anne knocked on the screen door with a tight smile and a folded piece of paper in her hand. I could tell by her eyes that she didn't want to be the one delivering it. "It was in everyone's mailbox after choir practice," she said, and handed me the bulletin. I opened it, half expecting to see something about a bake sale or the upcoming community yard sale. Instead, there it was. Third column, small print, tucked between prayer requests and volunteer shifts. A gentle reminder to be aware of signs of elder confusion or financial vulnerability in our parish community. If you or someone you love has been struggling with memory lapses or repeated financial errors, please reach out to our Wellness Outreach Committee for support. No names, no direct accusations, just enough to plant a seed. Enough to make people look at me sideways at the next service. I didn't speak. I folded the paper slowly and placed it beside my tea. Anne stood there awkwardly, then patted my shoulder and left without another word. She didn't need to say anything. Her eyes had already said it. She pitied me. She believed it. Lila had done what she always did best. She made me look fragile, and she made it look like concern. I didn't cry. I didn't slam drawers or pace the hallway. I went into the kitchen, sat at the table, and opened my notebook again. This changed the game. This wasn't just behind-the-scenes manipulation anymore. This was a public campaign. A slow poisoning of my name. And if she'd made her move publicly, it meant she was either bold enough to think I couldn't fight back, or confident that no one would believe me if I did. I wasn't going to correct her mistake. I was going to use it. That night, I printed out the bulletin and placed it into my growing file. Then I emailed Reverend Thomas and asked if we could meet in person the following week. He responded within an hour. "Of course," he wrote. "My door is always open." But that wasn't the only move Lila made that week. 2 days later, a letter arrived from the county clerk's office. It was addressed to both me and Daniel. That struck me first, because Daniel had been gone over a year. I opened it and found a duplicate notice of real property tax reassessment. I read it 3 times. Someone had submitted a request to reclassify the house as investment property instead of a primary residence. That reclassification came with a 26% increase in annual taxes. The form was signed and dated, and the signature wasn't mine. It was supposed to be Daniel's, but the date was after his death. She had crossed into territory I couldn't ignore. The next morning, I drove down to the county office, walked in with the letter and Daniel's death certificate, and asked to speak to a supervisor. They were kind, apologetic. The reassessment request would be withdrawn. An investigation would be opened. I gave them copies of what I had and made sure they documented that I'd never submitted any changes. Before I left, I asked if I could request a list of recent document filings made under my address. The clerk printed the list. I looked through it and saw 3 new entries, all submitted within the last 6 months, all tied to my name. all with the same handwriting in the comment margins. It was Lila, again and again, quiet attempts to change things in the background, twist small levers, shift minor settings, all without me knowing. Death by 1,000 bureaucratic cuts. I thanked the clerk, took the paperwork, and returned home. At the kitchen table, I laid it all out. The credit card theft, the forged loan agreement, the fake reassessment request, the bulletin. Each one by itself looked small, grey areas, innocent mistakes. But together they painted a very specific portrait. One woman steadily erasing another's credibility, access, and identity. With precision, with patience, with calculation. I added a new line to my case file. Active defamation of character. Public manipulation. Then I picked up the phone and called someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Detective Rachel Moss. She used to attend my women's group years ago when she was just starting out. Young, sharp, kind. Now she was head of financial crimes in the precinct. I didn't expect her to remember me. She picked up on the second ring. I said my name. There was a pause. Then she said, Maureen Hale, from the church group. I remember. I told her I needed 20 minutes of her time. Not as a police officer, not yet. Just as someone who could tell me if what I had qualified as something worth investigating. She told me to come in next week. Quiet. Off the record. I hung up the phone and exhaled. Then I looked at my notes again and underlined one sentence twice. She isn't just stealing from me. She's trying to turn me into someone who can't be trusted to stop her. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about identity. She wanted mine gone. And for the first time, I realized just how much of her life was built on the idea that I would never push back. But I was pushing now, and I wasn't going to stop. It happened on a Sunday morning, just before service. I was locking up my front door when I saw the envelope taped to my mailbox. No stamp, no return address. The paper was heavy stock, expensive, like the kind used for wedding invitations. For a second, I thought maybe someone had dropped off a thank you card. I had donated a quilt last month to the church's silent auction. But the moment I pulled the flap open and saw the contents, I knew it wasn't gratitude. Inside was a typed letter, formatted like a report. It had bullet points, dates, names. It claimed that I had become increasingly erratic, that I'd missed 2 appointments at the senior centre, had been seen wandering the neighbourhood confused, had raised my voice at the bank and accused a teller of stealing. All of it written in a tone of deep concern, and all of it completely false. There were no signatures, just a line at the bottom that said copies had been shared with the church leadership and with local adult protective services. It was a smear campaign, wrapped in community language. Every word had been crafted to look like concern, but it read like a death sentence for my credibility. Lila had gone further than I imagined. This wasn't subtle anymore. It was strategic. She was trying to build a paper trail of instability. One small whisper at a time, repeated across weeks, until the sum of it formed a profile that could be used against me. I stood there in the driveway, the wind tugging at my coat, and felt a cold calm settle into my bones. It was time to bait the trap. I went back inside and opened the locked cabinet in the hallway. Inside was the envelope of forged documents, the printed banking statements, the notary receipt, the reassessment notice. I laid them out and double-checked that everything was there. Then I added a new piece, a small custom-designed refund check made out to a fictional name. I created a dummy email address to back it up and used a prepaid phone number I'd picked up last week in cash. I logged the routing numbers, photocopied both sides of the check, and placed it in a plain gift bag along with a scented candle and a handwritten note. The note read, "Thought you'd appreciate this. Use it however you see fit. Then I slipped an active air tag underneath the base of the candle. I sealed the bag, tied the top with string, and drove across town. Lila was volunteering that morning at the parish hall, setting up tables for the youth fundraiser. I'd heard her talking about it to Anne 2 days earlier. I parked down the street, walked calmly into the hall, and smiled as I dropped the gift bag onto the folding table near the back exit. She was in the far corner, arranging cookies with 2 other women. I didn't approach her. I didn't say a word. I just left the bag there and walked out as if nothing had happened. Back in the car, I opened the tracking app and waited. 46 minutes later, the AirTag pinged. Location, Lila's house. That night, I watched the log update every few hours. By midnight, the bag hadn't moved again. But I noticed something else. A new transaction appeared in the dummy account tied to the refund check. A deposit attempt. It was small, just under $3,000. It matched the check amount, and it had been submitted at an ATM 10 miles from Lila's address. I called Eleanor. She walked me through what to do next. Freeze the account, screenshot everything, back up the logs, document the AirTag movement in real time. I stayed up past 2 a.m., watching the data come in, organizing it into folders, labeling each timestamp. By morning, I had enough to prove she had accepted a check she wasn't supposed to receive, enough to tie it to the bait envelope, enough to show movement from drop point to destination, and most importantly, enough to raise questions about intent. I didn't need her to cash it. I only needed her to accept it and try. Later that day, I received a phone call from an unknown number. I let it ring to voicemail. When I played it back, I recognized Lila's voice, but not her tone. It was strained, edgy. She said she found something in a bag that might have been meant for someone else. Said she'd be happy to return it if I preferred that. Her words were tight, too carefully chosen. She was nervous. She knew the trap had snapped. But instead of confronting her, I did something else. I printed the voicemail transcript, saved the audio, and filed it with the rest of my evidence. Then I emailed Reverend Thomas and confirmed our upcoming meeting. I told him I had a few private concerns and would appreciate a quiet setting. He responded within the hour. That evening, I sat down and wrote out every single step Lila had taken in the last 6 weeks, from the forged notary forms to the church bulletin to the false report to adult services. I listed every date, every witness, every action, and then on the last page I wrote, "Her next move will be desperation. She thinks I'm boxed in, but I've only just started. The next time she tried to frame me, it wouldn't be a whisper. It would be a scream caught on record, a public unraveling, a mask falling in front of everyone. And this time, I would make sure no one looked away." The sun had barely crept over the rooftops when I pulled into the parking lot behind the jewelry store. It sat quietly between a pet supply outlet and a shuttered yoga studio, nothing about it particularly flashy. But the store name matched a charge Lila had made the week Daniel passed. And that charge had gone through on the virtual card I'd marked as bait, just a few days after the check incident. I parked 2 rows away and waited, watching through the windshield. At 9:58, Lila's silver SUV rolled in, eased into the handicapped spot near the side entrance. She stepped out, dressed like she was headed to brunch with old friends, not laundering stolen money through luxury purchases. White linen pants, clean pink blouse, hair pinned back like a woman without a worry in the world. She greeted the store manager at the door with a kiss on the cheek. He laughed like it wasn't the first time. I waited until they disappeared inside, then pulled out my phone and refreshed the transaction log. Another entry had posted. $475. Merchant code Jewelry, in store. She'd taken the bait twice now. The first was the refund check. This time it was the virtual card I'd named under a false foundation I invented. She had no idea she was making purchases on a card linked to an account I controlled. Everything she touched left a fingerprint. I texted Eleanor. She replied with one word: move. That night, I sat down at the kitchen table and organized the receipts. Every charge made through the bait card, every timestamp, every cross-reference to the store's name. I printed screenshots, lined them up in sequence, added them to the growing binder. But it was Clara's voice that changed everything. The next morning, I was dropping off canned goods at the community pantry behind the church when I saw her sitting on the steps. Clara, 15, sweet girl, daughter of Teresa Jimenez. Her mother had been battling cancer for years, and the church had been raising money to help cover treatment. Clara waved at me. I sat beside her, asked how her mum was doing. She told me they'd had another setback. New medication was expensive, but someone had promised to help. She said Lila was organizing a small auction using some donated jewelry. Clara said Lila had picked out a piece herself and told her it would be sold at the upcoming fundraiser in her mother's name. I asked her if she had seen the jewelry. She pulled out her phone and showed me a photo. A silver necklace with blue topaz. Same as the one I'd seen on the receipt from the bait card. Same amount, same day. Lila wasn't just stealing. She was laundering the money through a charitable cause, turning my funds into what looked like generosity, using a sick woman's name as a shield. And now she was parading that false kindness in front of children. That night, I sat with Eleanor in her living room, binder in hand. We reviewed the latest transactions. She highlighted Clara's story and added a new section to our timeline. I brought up the fact that the upcoming fundraiser was scheduled during Sunday service, right after Reverend Thomas's message. Eleanor leaned forward and said it was the perfect moment. I didn't answer right away. My hands were cold, even though the room was warm. I had spent weeks gathering quiet facts, documenting patterns, staying calm. But something about seeing Clara on those steps, hopeful, unaware she was part of a bigger lie, it broke something in me. Not in a loud way, but in the kind of way that settles and hardens. I knew then that the next move wouldn't be private. It had to be seen. Not for revenge, but for truth. For every person Lila had smiled at while twisting a knife behind their back. I spent the next 2 days preparing. I called the store manager at the jewelry shop and scheduled a private appointment, pretending to be a donor curious about items at the auction. I didn't mention Lila. Inside the store, I asked to see the piece in the fundraiser photo. The manager nodded, said it had been placed aside for a church event. When I asked if it had been purchased or donated, he checked the records, said it had been purchased by a woman named Lila Hart using a foundation credit card, then donated under the same name. He showed me the receipt. I asked for a copy. He hesitated, but I explained I was coordinating with the committee and needed verification. He printed it. I thanked him and left. That evening, I added the receipt to the binder. Then I printed 2 more copies, one for Detective Moss, one for Reverend Thomas. I emailed the Reverend and told him I would be bringing materials to our Sunday meeting. I asked if I could speak after the service, during the general announcements. "Just a few minutes," I said. He replied the next morning with a simple yes. By then, I had one last item to secure. I went into the back room and pulled out Daniel's original signature from a tax return he filed the year before his illness. I placed it beside the notarized loan amendment Lila had forged. I labeled the top of the page in red ink, "Comparison Sample." "Final Proof." I stared at the 2 lines. Daniel's writing was precise, slanted just slightly to the left, with a clean curl on the D. The forged version was straight, too even, too careful. I slipped both into a plastic sleeve and added it to the front of the binder. Then I closed it, locked it in the cabinet, and made a single note in my journal. She used my name. She used Daniel's memory. She used Clara's hope. Next Sunday, she will use nothing, because by the time I'm done, no one will see her the same again, not even herself. Sunday came with a stillness I hadn't felt in weeks. The house was quiet, almost respectful, as I moved through my morning routine. I dressed with care, chose a soft grey blouse, clean slacks, and Daniel's silver watch. I packed my binder into a leather satchel Eleanor had loaned me. Everything had its place. No detail was rushed. I took my time because I knew once I stepped out the door, I would not be returning as the same woman. This was no longer about suspicion, or reaction, or defending myself. This was about putting the full truth on display, each document, each receipt, each betrayal, in order, on record, in front of every person who had once smiled at my sister and believed every word she said. The parking lot at church was already full when I arrived. I parked far back, as I always did. I wanted to walk in like anyone else, not hidden, not grand, just grounded, present. Inside, the sanctuary buzzed with soft chatter. Pews filled with familiar faces, families, couples, long-time neighbours. Reverend Thomas stood near the altar, nodding to a deacon. When he saw me, his expression shifted, warmer, more intentional. He gave me a small, knowing nod. I gave one back. The service began the way they always did. A hymn, scripture, community updates. I sat quietly, the binder resting across my lap, one hand flat over it like it was something sacred. And in some ways, it was. It held the truth. But more than that, it held the version of myself I'd refused to let her erase. After the sermon, Reverend Thomas gestured toward me from the pulpit, his voice calm, even, kind. Maureen Hale has asked to share a few words this morning. I've given her the floor. Thank you for receiving her with the same openness you've always shown. I stood slowly, walked up the aisle with deliberate steps. My hands were steady. I didn't look at Lila. I didn't need to. She was seated in the third pew, 2 rows behind the choir, wearing her usual Sunday white. Face unreadable. I reached the pulpit and took a breath. No papers, no microphone adjustments, just voice and presence. I began with one sentence. My husband, Daniel Hale, was an honest man. A few heads nodded. Some faces softened. I am here this morning because someone has been working to change how that legacy is remembered. Not with noise, not with open lies, but with quiet, steady erosion. I opened the binder, turned it toward the front row, and pulled the first page free. A loan agreement, forged. Second page. An amended insurance form. Signature does not match Daniel's. Document dated after he lost the ability to write. I continued, each document its own quiet strike. The tax reassessment, the fake refund check, the credit card charges, the AirTag data, the receipts from the jewelry store, the voicemail. I named no one. I did not raise my voice. I let the details speak. Then I paused. I reached the page with Clara's photo, the necklace, the timestamp, the proof it was purchased using my bait card, donated under the name of a false foundation, sold in the name of charity. I let that image rest in silence for a moment, and then I said, to use a child's hope, to use the story of her mother's illness, to hide theft behind generosity, is not just cruelty, it is cowardice. The room shifted. A stillness, heavy now. No murmurs. Just quiet realization settling over the congregation like dust in sunlight. I closed the binder and stepped back. I have submitted this evidence to the proper legal channels. The matter is not over, but the silence is. And then I thanked them. Reverend Thomas returned to the pulpit, his voice even more careful than before. He said he would be reviewing everything, that no one was above accountability, not even those closest to our church family. When I returned to my seat, I did not look at Lila. I didn't need to, because I could feel the shift in the room. The warmth she once relied on to shield her was gone. The eyes that used to look at her with admiration now searched for explanations she could not give. The rest of the service went on, but nothing felt the same. When it ended, no one approached me with platitudes. There were no hugs or apologies, only nods. Some brief touches to the shoulder, a kind of quiet, collective recognition. Outside, the air was cool. A breeze passed through the parking lot like a sigh of something released. Lila stayed inside. I saw her through the stained glass, still seated, still holding her hymnal like it might anchor her. I didn't wait. I walked to my car, unlocked the door, and drove away. Back home, I placed the binder back into its drawer and locked it. Then I sat in the living room and poured myself a glass of water. The house felt lighter. The war was not over. But the fog had lifted, and now, for the first time in weeks, I felt something I hadn't dared touch. Relief. Quiet. Steady. Earned. The morning after the service, I received an email from Reverend Thomas. He thanked me for what he called my clarity and courage, and confirmed he had forwarded the documents to the church board. He said there would be a meeting later in the week to discuss what came next. His tone was gentle, but there was a weight in his words that hadn't been there before. A shift in authority. A door had opened, and now it couldn't be closed again. I thought that would be the end of it, or at least the pause. But by mid-afternoon, the consequences began arriving in sharp, deliberate waves. Detective Rachel Moss called first. She had received my binder, reviewed the materials, and confirmed that multiple parts of the case now fell under financial crimes jurisdiction. She spoke carefully, professionally, but not without empathy. She said the forged loan document and the amended insurance paperwork would be enough to open a full investigation. The AirTag tracking, the fraudulent use of the refund check, and the bait card added weight. Patterns of behavior. Premeditation. Consistency. She told me that once her department had completed their internal review, a formal charge recommendation would follow. That was their next move. Quiet, but serious. Then, 2 hours later, a car pulled into my driveway. It was Anne, my neighbor. She stepped out slowly, holding a pie in one hand and a folded piece of paper in the other. I met her at the edge of the porch. She didn't say much, just that she'd seen the documents I presented, that she hadn't known the full story, that she felt foolish for ever believing what Lila had said. She handed me the pie and the note, and left before I could answer. Inside the note was a list of names. 5 members of the congregation. Each one had apparently come forward that morning, quietly, to admit things Lila had told them about me. Little stories, half-truths, subtle digs. One woman said Lila had claimed I was secretly controlling Daniel's estate to hide a gambling addiction. Another said Lila had once hinted I was suffering from early-onset dementia, and that Daniel had covered for me. It was like finding a string and pulling it, only to realize the string had been stitched through every corner of the room. Lila had been preparing for this for years, and now the stitching was coming undone all at once. By evening, I had heard from Eleanor, who said she'd received a voicemail from a woman on the church committee. The woman asked if Eleanor could verify certain details about the forged notary documents. Eleanor told her she could. The committee was forming its own response, even as the police did their part. And through all of it, I heard nothing from Lila. Not a call, not a knock at the door, not a single word. I thought maybe she would show up, offer some half-hearted denial, a desperate twist, an apology laced with excuses. But she didn't. Instead, someone else did. At dusk, a young man arrived at my doorstep. His name was Michael. He introduced himself as the assistant manager at the jewelry store where Lila had made her recent purchases. He had heard about what happened at church and wanted me to know that he and the owner had already spoken with Detective Moss. They were willing to submit security footage and sales logs confirming Lila's transactions. They had nothing to hide, he said, and they didn't want to be involved in any deceitful donations. He handed me a printed statement, signed by both himself and the store owner, detailing the dates of the purchases and the method of payment. The foundation card Lila had used matched the account I had created for bait purposes. It was clean, direct, unshakable. Michael left with a short nod, nothing more. I watched his taillights disappear down the street and stood at the edge of the porch for a long time. The day had not brought noise or drama. It had brought precision. The kind of unraveling that didn't come with shouting or confrontation. The kind that moved through a place like wind through trees, silent but total. Lila had spent years shaping a story around me. She painted herself as the patient sister, the caretaker, the brave one in the face of a fading sibling. And it worked because I never fought back, because I stayed quiet, because I thought dignity came from silence. But silence, I'd learned, can also look like consent. So I stopped consenting. And now the truth had grown too loud for her to whisper over. That night, I sat at the dining table with the binder open. I added Michael's letter, labeled it Exhibit G, then I updated the index. Every section complete, every page in place. When I finished, I poured a glass of water and carried it into the living room. The air felt different, lighter, somehow, as though the walls themselves had heard what I said at church and decided to let go of what they'd been holding. I didn't sleep right away. I stayed up listening to the quiet, the kind of quiet that follows storm winds, not peaceful, but certain, clean. And just before midnight, I wrote a single line in my journal. The storm didn't knock her down. It revealed she had no shelter left. The knock came just before 10 on Wednesday morning. It was not rushed or angry, just firm, measured. I had been expecting it, though not quite this soon. When I opened the door, Detective Rachel Moss stood on the porch. She was dressed plainly, in a grey blazer and dark slacks, no badge displayed, no car parked directly in front of my house. She greeted me with a nod, and I motioned for her to step inside. We didn't sit in the living room. We went straight to the dining table where the binder still lay, open to the last updated page. She placed a manila folder on the table and said her department had completed its preliminary review. She had spoken with the county assessor's office, the notary, the jewelry store, and the bank. The documents I had submitted had matched what her department recovered. She told me that earlier that morning, her office had issued an official notification of pending charges against Lila. They would be contacting her formally that afternoon. It wasn't an arrest, not yet, but it would trigger the process. Forgery, identity fraud, fraudulent misrepresentation, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Even though I wasn't legally classified as vulnerable, the documented pattern, combined with Lila's attempt to paint me as cognitively impaired, gave the department cause to apply that clause. Rachel slid a copy of the notice toward me, the seal from the department printed across the top. My hands didn't shake. I simply read it, one line at a time. They weren't just accusations anymore. They were real, tracked, named, labeled by law. And for the first time since the day I stood in front of the freezer aisle, holding that declined receipt, I felt the weight shift. I asked her if I needed to appear in person yet. She said not yet. But when the time came, they would let me know. She had already flagged the church bulletin and Lila's earlier letter to Adult Protective Services as part of the smear pattern. The department considered that relevant in assessing Lila's intent and her efforts to silence or discredit me before being exposed. Rachel paused before she left. Said this case had stuck with her. Not because of the financial trail, but because of how slow and deliberate it all had been. She said most people in these situations don't have the patience to fight back with evidence. They lash out, they burn bridges, and then they lose credibility. But I didn't. She called that rare. After she left, I sat down with the copy of the pending charges and read through each line again. They were worded in technical language, but I understood them for what they were. This was the end of Lila's grip on my life. Not just the money, not just the documents, but the quiet war she'd been waging for years. The sideways glances, the whispered doubts, the steady undermining of who I was and how I was seen. Later that day, Reverend Thomas called. He had met with the church board. They had voted unanimously to suspend Lila from all volunteer positions, pending further review. Her access to church finances, committees, and donation handling had been revoked. They would be releasing a statement to the congregation by the end of the week, acknowledging what had occurred without naming me or Lila directly. He said he had no doubt people would understand who the statement referred to. He sounded tired. He also sounded relieved. That evening, Eleanor came by with a bottle of wine and a smile that didn't try to hide anything. She said it was time. Time for Lila to face what she had done. Time for me to stop carrying it alone. We sat on the porch and watched the light fall across the lawn. No one said much. We didn't need to. The neighborhood was quieter than usual. I saw Anne across the street trimming her roses. She glanced up and nodded at me. A simple gesture, but different than before. It wasn't pity. It was respect. Around 7, my phone rang. It was Clara's mother, Teresa. Her voice cracked almost immediately. She had heard about everything. The fundraiser, the jewelry, the forged donations. She apologized over and over. I stopped her, told her she had nothing to be sorry for. She said her daughter had cried when she learned the truth, that she thought she had done something wrong. I told her Clara had done everything right. After we hung up, I sat in the kitchen and stared out the window. I remembered Clara sitting on the church steps, hopeful, unaware. Now she knew. And somehow she still hadn't lost that light in her voice. That meant something. By the time I went to bed, I felt the shift had landed. Not just around me, but inside me. For so long I had lived with the idea that staying silent protected people, that absorbing things without reacting made me strong. But silence hadn't protected Daniel's memory. It hadn't stopped Lila from manipulating our community. It hadn't stopped her from nearly rewriting the life I had spent decades building. But this had. Not the confrontation, the clarity, not the anger, the evidence, and not just the truth, the proof of it. When I closed the light that night, the house felt still. Not like the kind of stillness that follows pain, the kind that follows justice. Quiet, unmistakable, unafraid. It was Friday morning when Lila showed up at my door. No call, no warning, just the sound of her car pulling into my driveway, the slam of the door, and then the deliberate knock. 3 slow raps against the wood. I knew she would come eventually. That kind of ego doesn't vanish in silence. It lingers, searches for a crack to squeeze through. I didn't rush to open the door. I let her stand out there for a minute. I wanted her to feel the weight. When I opened it, she looked smaller, still dressed well, but not polished. Her blouse was wrinkled, her makeup not quite settled. She held her purse tightly with both hands, like it was some kind of shield. She asked if she could come in. I didn't answer. I just stepped aside. She walked into the living room, not like someone comfortable, but like someone entering a courtroom. Every movement cautious. Her eyes scanned the room like she expected someone else to be there. I could feel her calculating, looking for weakness, some sign I had softened. She sat on the edge of the couch. I didn't offer her coffee. I didn't offer anything. She started talking, said she knew things had gotten out of hand, that she had never meant for it to go this far, that the money was just meant to be temporary, that she had been in a difficult place emotionally after Daniel passed, that she wasn't thinking clearly, that she had been trying to find ways to feel connected to something again. I said nothing. She kept going, said the charges were too much, that she didn't understand how I could take it to this level, that family didn't do this to each other, that there were better ways to resolve things. I let her speak. For nearly 10 minutes, she unraveled every excuse she could reach for. None of them new, all of them rehearsed. But beneath the performance, I could see it. The panic. She hadn't expected me to follow through. She had counted on my silence, and now she wanted a private resolution. When she finished, I walked to the dining room table and picked up the envelope Detective Moss had left with me. I didn't hand it to her. I just placed it on the table between us. Pending charges, official documentation, her name in print. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she looked up and asked if I was really going to let them press charges. I told her I wasn't letting anyone do anything, that the truth had taken over now, that it was moving on its own. I told her that the people she had lied to, stolen from, and used had a right to see it all through. She asked what I wanted. I told her I didn't want anything from her. Not anymore. That was the difference between us. She had always wanted something. Control, sympathy, access, image. Everything she did had a hook. Even now, her apology was a transaction. She wanted something in return. But I was finished making trades. She sat there, silent, the envelope untouched. Finally, she stood, walked to the door, turned back, and said something low, almost too soft to hear, that I had ruined everything. And for the first time in our lives, I didn't argue with her, because she was right. I had ruined everything. The lies, the manipulation, the performance. I had pulled it all apart. When she left, I didn't watch her drive away. I went to the kitchen, made a fresh pot of coffee, and opened the back door to let in the breeze. It was early fall. The leaves were just beginning to turn, and the air had that first crispness that makes the edges of the world feel sharper. I sat on the porch and drank slowly, my hands wrapped around the mug. Not in celebration, not in triumph, but in release. Later that day, Eleanor came by with the final review documents from the legal team. Everything was in order. The church had issued its statement. The precinct had completed their initial interviews. The committee overseeing donation accountability had already begun implementing new protocols. Lila's access had been revoked permanently. Her name had been removed from the charity registry. The foundation she had used to mask the thefts had been flagged and frozen. And the church had officially opened a scholarship fund under Daniel's name, funded entirely by redirected donations and restitution from the fraudulent activity. The money Lila took was being put back into the community. That was the part that stayed with me. Not the punishment, the repair, the return. That night, I lit a candle beside Daniel's photo, not for grief, but for completion. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to defend his memory. It was standing on its own again, strong, untouched, whole. I went to sleep with the windows open, the breeze moving gently through the curtains. There was no noise outside, no cars, no footsteps, just the sound of my house breathing quietly in the dark. And this time, it didn't feel like I was bracing for something to come. It felt like the worst had already passed, and I was still here. The following week moved slower, but not in the way things usually slow down after a storm. It wasn't silence, it was clarity. The kind that doesn't ask for attention, just makes itself known in everything it touches. The house felt cleaner somehow, though nothing had been scrubbed. My body felt lighter, though I hadn't slept any better than usual. There was simply less weight in the air, less pretending, less watching my own steps. Word in the neighborhood spread, but it spread quietly. No one rang my bell looking for gossip. No one called to dig for details. Most just kept their distance with a new kind of caution. Not fear, just awareness. Like they had suddenly realized I had always been paying attention. On Thursday, I drove to the library to return a book I hadn't even finished. It was something Daniel once read, and I had borrowed it again for comfort during those first few weeks after he passed. I remember holding it close on nights I couldn't sleep. Now I no longer needed it by the bedside. I walked it in and left it at the desk. As I turned to leave, the librarian, a soft-spoken woman in her 40s, stopped me and asked if I would be willing to donate a copy of Daniel's financial ethics journal. She said the local college wanted to stock it again, now that students were asking questions about legacy work in estate planning. I told her I would. It was a small thing, but it meant something. His name, once tangled in Lila's lies, was now finding its way back into the world in a way he would have been proud of. That night, I sat down at the desk in the study and opened the bottom drawer. I pulled out the last unopened letter Daniel had written me. It had been sealed the day before his final round of treatment. I hadn't read it. Not because I was afraid, but because I believed in timing. Some words are meant for when the dust settles. Inside was a single sheet, folded neatly. His handwriting filled the page, steady, but fading in parts. He wrote not about death, but about character. He reminded me who I was, told me to trust my judgment, not in crisis, but in the aftermath, that it would be easy to question everything when the world felt loud. But he told me that when things quieted again, I would know the truth in my bones. And I did. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back into the drawer, not because it belonged there, but because I wanted to keep it close. The next day, the church posted a public bulletin reaffirming the creation of the Daniel Hale Scholarship Fund. They named 3 recipients, young adults from the community. One was Clara, the girl who had been used without her knowing. Her name in print brought a smile to my face that lingered longer than I expected. The board had also begun a formal review of how donations and volunteer oversight would be handled moving forward. My documentation had become part of the church's new accountability training. They asked if I would be willing to speak to future leaders about how deception can take root in familiar spaces. I said yes. I didn't do it to relive the pain. I did it because I understood now that silence is how harm grows, and if I had learned to speak, maybe others could too. By Sunday, the pace of things had settled again. I went to service not as a symbol, not as someone watched, but as myself, the same woman I had always been. A few people stopped me on the way in. They didn't offer apologies, just nods. A shared kind of quiet that said, "I see you differently now." and I didn't mind being seen. Afterward, I walked out of the sanctuary and into the side garden where Daniel and I used to sit after service. The bench was still there, worn at the edges, but holding strong. I sat for a while, the sun catching the tops of the hedges, a soft wind moving through the leaves. Behind me, the church bell rang. Not a sound of warning, not a call to arms, just a sound that meant things would keep going, that the world, in its imperfect way, had made room again. And for the first time in months, I breathed without checking to see who was watching, because no one owned my story now. Not Lila, not the whispers, not the fear. It belonged to me, and I was finally telling it all the way through. It had been 3 months since Lila walked out of my house for the last time. The legal process moved forward slowly but surely. Detective Moss stayed in touch, keeping me updated as her team finalized the charges and submitted the case to the district attorney's office. There were no sudden twists, no last-minute reversals, just paperwork, phone calls, evidence, all of it steady, all of it real. Lila made no attempt to contact me again, not through letters, not through third parties. I assumed her lawyer had told her to stay away, or maybe she finally understood there was nothing left to salvage. Whatever her reasons, I didn't care. Her silence, this time, was the most honest thing she had ever given me. Fall settled over the town like a warm quilt. The leaves turned amber and rust. The air sharpened. I found myself outside more than usual, walking the garden, sweeping the porch, reading old letters from Daniel beside the back window with the sun warming my lap. Everything slowed down, but nothing felt empty. That was the surprising part. I had spent so long bracing for loss that I didn't know what to do with stillness, with space that wasn't echoing. But it turns out healing doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it's quiet meals, fresh coffee, a good night's sleep without waking up scanning for signs of betrayal. People had started asking me to speak, not just at the church, but at the local community centre and the small college nearby. They wanted me to share what had happened, how I handled it, what others could learn from it. At first, I hesitated. I didn't want to become the story, but then I realized I already was. And if telling it helped even one person protect themselves or find their voice, then maybe all this mess could mean something more than justice. So I spoke. Once, then again. Each time, the words came easier. Less weight, more truth. Not every part of the aftermath was graceful. Some people still didn't know how to look at me. Others offered too much sympathy, like I was fragile. But most just gave me space, and that was enough. The scholarship fund grew faster than expected. Clara had sent me a handwritten note with a photo of her mother smiling next to her college acceptance letter. She said the money would help cover her textbooks and her train rides home. Said she wanted to study public health so she could give back to families like hers. I pinned her photo on the bulletin board above my desk, not as a reminder of what had been taken, but of what was still possible. One morning, while clearing out a storage chest in the guest room, I found a small music box Daniel had given me for our 25th anniversary. I hadn't opened it in years. I wound it up, and the soft notes played like no time had passed at all. And I cried. Not from sadness, from fullness, because I could finally feel him again. Not as someone I lost, but someone I carried with me. In the way I stood my ground, in the way I fought clean, in the way I kept walking forward. The wound Lila tried to make permanent had become something else entirely. Not a scar, a seam, one that held me together. By December, the air had cooled enough to bring in frost on the windows. I hung a wreath on the door, baked a batch of gingerbread cookies, and mailed out simple cards to those who had stood by me. Not long messages, just thank yous, meant fully, sent freely. On Christmas Eve, I lit a candle in the front room and sat by the window, watching the lights flicker on across the neighborhood. There was no bitterness in me, only breath, only warmth, only peace. Not the kind that denies the past, but the kind that accepts it, learns from it, and leaves it where it belongs, behind. I knew there would still be moments where grief would pass through again. That's just how memory works. But now I had something stronger to meet it with. Truth, and a life that no longer needed to be defended, just lived. If you stayed with me through this story, thank you. Sometimes the hardest battles happen quietly, inside families, behind closed doors. And healing doesn't always look like winning. Sometimes it looks like choosing yourself. If this story reminded you of something you've faced or made you feel seen in any way, I'm glad you found it. Let me know in the comments if you'd like to hear more stories about family, justice, or healing. And remember, your voice matters, even when it shakes, especially then. Take care of yourselves.